Imagine, if you will, a small aircraft cutting through the fading light of a Nevada evening sometime in the mid-1950s. Below, the desert stretches endlessly in every direction, painted in shades of rust and gold by the setting sun. There are no roads out here, no towns, no signs of human life for miles in any direction, just scrubland, distant mountains, and a flat, cracked lakebed that shimmers like a mirage even as twilight approaches. The pilot banks gently descending toward that lakebed. He's been here before, but each time the isolation still takes his breath away. This is Groom Lake, a place so remote that even the miners who once searched for silver in these hills eventually gave up and moved on. In a few short years, this forgotten corner of the American West will become the most secretive piece of real estate on Earth. But for now, it's just dust and silence, and the lonely cry of desert birds. Tonight, we're going to explore what really happened at this place the world would come to know as Area 51. Not the stories about little green men and crashed flying saucers. Those tales make for entertaining movies, but they obscure something far more interesting. The true story involves real human beings pushing the boundaries of what was thought possible, living double lives their own families knew nothing about, and accidentally creating one of the most enduring mysteries of the 20th century. We'll walk through the desolate beauty of the Nevada desert in the years before the government arrived. We'll meet the brilliant engineers who built aircraft that seemed to belong in science fiction. We'll hear from the workers who spent years unable to tell even their spouses what they did for a living, and we'll trace how a legitimate need for military secrecy transformed into one of the strangest cultural phenomena America has ever produced. By the time we're finished, you'll understand how a patch of empty desert became America's most guarded secret. You'll meet the engineers and pilots who risked everything in the name of national security. And you'll discover how the truth about this place is, in many ways, more remarkable than any science fiction. So close your eyes if you like, and let's travel back to a time before the secrets, before the fences and warning signs, before Area 51 existed at all. Long before any government agent ever set foot near Groom Lake, this land had a different kind of story to tell. In the 1860s, prospectors pushing into the Nevada wilderness discovered veins of silver and lead running through the mountains near what would eventually become the test site. A man named Patrick Sheehan built a humble homestead here in 1889, founding what he called the Groom Mine. The Sheehan family worked this land for decades, scratching a modest living from the unforgiving earth. Try to imagine what this place looked like back then. The nearest town of any size, Las Vegas, wouldn't even be founded until 1905. There were no paved roads, no electricity, no running water, just endless desert sky and the silence that comes from being truly, utterly alone. The Sheehans, and the few other souls who ventured this way, were hardy people, the kind who found comfort in isolation rather than fearing it. The miners who worked these hills in the late 1800s lived lives of extraordinary hardship. They dug into mountainsides with hand tools, following veins of precious metal that might peter out after a few feet or might lead to fortune. Most found only disappointment. The silver and lead deposits around Groom Lake were modest compared to the great strikes at the Comstock Lode or Tonopah, but they were enough to keep determined men digging year after year. These early settlers left their mark on the landscape. Abandoned mine shafts still dot the mountains surrounding Groom Lake. Their entrances often collapsed, but their presence recorded in historical surveys. Old stone foundations mark where cabins once stood, sheltering miners during the brutal winter months when snow covered the desert floor and temperatures plunged below zero. The Sheehan family maintained their presence longer than most, holding on to their mining claims even as others gave up. When the government came looking for land to test nuclear weapons in the late 1940s, the Sheehans found themselves with neighbors they had never anticipated. The mushroom clouds that rose from the Nevada test site were visible from their homestead. Artificial suns that lit the desert sky and left radioactive fallout drifting on the wind. Eventually, the government would acquire most of the Sheehan holdings, absorbing their property into the ever-expanding restricted zone around Groom Lake. But that process took decades, and for years the family continued mining and ranching on land that bordered one of the most secret facilities in American history. They watched unmarked aircraft take off and land in the distance. They noticed the construction expanding year by year, and they kept their own counsel, as desert people tend to do. The land itself is remarkable in its starkness. Groom Lake isn't really a lake at all, but what geologists call a playa, a flat, cracked bed of dried mud and salt, left behind by ancient waters that evaporated thousands of years ago. When it rains, which isn't often, the lake bed briefly floods, creating a thin sheet of water that reflects the sky like a mirror. Then the sun returns, the water vanishes, and the cracked white surface remains, stretching for miles in every direction, perfectly flat and perfectly smooth. The surrounding terrain tells its own ancient story. The mountain ranges that rim the valley were thrust upward millions of years ago by the same geological forces that shaped the American West. Their slopes are covered with creosote bush and Joshua trees, the hardy vegetation that somehow survives in a place where summer temperatures routinely exceed 100 degrees and rain might not fall for months at a time. This geological quirk would prove essential to what came later, a natural runway provided by the Earth itself, waiting for aircraft that hadn't even been dreamed of yet. During World War II, the government began eyeing Nevada for a different purpose. The nation needed somewhere to develop and test nuclear weapons, and Nevada offered exactly what was required: thousands of square miles of empty federal land, far from prying eyes and population centers. In 1950, the Nevada Test and Training Range was established, encompassing nearly 3 million acres of desert. That's roughly 3 times the size of Rhode Island, an almost incomprehensible expanse of restricted territory. Within this range, the government designated the Nevada Test Site, a section of land where the Atomic Energy Commission would detonate more than 900 nuclear devices over the following decades. The mushroom clouds that rose from this desert became a strange kind of tourist attraction. People in Las Vegas would gather on rooftops to watch the distant explosions, the sky lighting up with artificial suns while they sipped cocktails and marveled at the power their government had harnessed. Hotels advertised viewing parties for atomic tests. Beauty pageants crowned Miss Atomic Bomb. The mushroom cloud became an unofficial symbol of the city, printed on postcards and casino tokens. It seems almost unimaginable today, this casual embrace of nuclear devastation as entertainment, but it speaks to the era's strange mixture of fear and fascination with the technology that might end civilization. The fallout from those tests drifted with the winds, sometimes settling on communities downwind who had never been warned about the dangers. The full health consequences wouldn't be acknowledged for decades. But in the early 1950s, most Americans believed their government when it told them the tests were safe. Conducted in the interest of national security, nothing to worry about. Just a few miles outside the test site boundary, the dry lake bed at Groom Lake sat waiting. And in the early 1950s, as the Cold War intensified and American anxiety about Soviet capabilities reached fever pitch, the people who would transform this empty place into something extraordinary began to take notice. The story of Area 51 really begins with fear. In the early 1950s, American military and intelligence leaders were gripped by a terrifying uncertainty. They simply didn't know what the Soviet Union was capable of. Reports suggested the Soviets were building long-range bombers that could deliver nuclear weapons to American cities. Other intelligence hinted at missile programs that might render traditional defenses obsolete. But the truth was, nobody really knew for certain what was happening behind the Iron Curtain. This uncertainty had a name: the bomber gap. Military planners warned President Eisenhower that the Soviets might have more nuclear-capable aircraft than the United States. The potential consequences were unthinkable. America needed information, and it needed it desperately. The fear wasn't abstract. Just a few years earlier, the Soviet Union had successfully tested its first atomic bomb, years ahead of American predictions. Intelligence analysts who had confidently assured political leaders that the Soviets were a decade away from nuclear capability had been proven catastrophically wrong. Now those same analysts were warning about Soviet bomber fleets, but their credibility was shattered. How could anyone be certain they weren't wrong again? The problem was how to get reliable information. There were no spy satellites in those days. Human intelligence assets inside the Soviet Union were nearly impossible to place and maintain. The KGB was ruthlessly efficient at identifying and eliminating foreign agents. The few sources America had were fragmentary at best, unreliable at worst. The only realistic option was aerial reconnaissance, flying planes over Soviet territory to photograph military installations. But Soviet air defenses were formidable. Any conventional aircraft flying over Russia would be detected and shot down. The political consequences of such an incident would be severe. An American plane caught violating Soviet airspace could trigger an international crisis, possibly even war. What the country needed was a plane that could fly higher than any anti-aircraft missile could reach, higher than any Soviet fighter could climb. It needed to be practically invisible, a phantom that could slip across enemy borders, photograph everything of importance, and return home before anyone knew it had been there. Enter Clarence Kelly Johnson, perhaps the most brilliant aircraft designer in American history. Johnson ran Lockheed's Advanced Development Projects division, better known by its nickname Skunk Works. The name came from a Lil Abner comic strip, where a mysterious moonshine still called the Skunk Works produced a peculiar brew. The engineers adopted the nickname, slightly cleaned up, for their own operation where strange and wonderful machines were being concocted. Johnson was a legendary figure even then. He had designed the P-38 Lightning fighter that helped win World War II. He had created the first American jet fighter to enter production. His small team of elite engineers worked with minimal bureaucracy and maximum creativity, producing revolutionary aircraft in record time while larger defense contractors struggled with cost overruns and delays. Now they turned their attention to what seemed like an impossible challenge. The specifications called for an aircraft that could cruise at 70,000 feet or higher for extended periods, covering thousands of miles while carrying sophisticated camera equipment. At that altitude, the plane would be above 90% of the Earth's atmosphere. The sky wouldn't be blue anymore, it would be black, with stars visible even in daylight. The pilot would essentially be flying at the edge of space. Johnson's answer was the U-2, a strange and beautiful aircraft, unlike anything that had flown before. With its long, glider-like wings and single engine, it looked more like a sailplane than a military machine. But those wings were the key. They allowed the U-2 to climb to altitudes above 60,000 feet, more than 11 miles above the Earth's surface, where the sky turns from blue to black and the curvature of the planet becomes visible on the horizon. The design involved countless trade-offs. To achieve the necessary altitude, the aircraft had to be as light as possible. The airframe was built from thin aluminum, so light that mechanics could accidentally poke holes in it with their fingers if they weren't careful. The landing gear was unusual, a bicycle arrangement with one wheel in front and one behind, plus small outrigger wheels under the wings that fell away at takeoff. This saved weight but made landing extremely tricky. The pilot had to balance the aircraft on two wheels while bleeding off speed, then let one wingtip drop gently to the ground after coming to a stop. The pilots who flew the U-2 were a special breed. They had to possess not just exceptional flying skills, but the psychological fortitude to operate alone at the edge of space for hours at a time. The cockpit was so cramped that stretching was impossible. The pressure suit was so restrictive that even turning your head was difficult. And the knowledge that a single malfunction could mean death, with no possibility of rescue, hung over every mission. Many of these pilots came from backgrounds in military aviation, but the U-2 required capabilities beyond what standard fighter training provided. They had to master the unique handling characteristics of an aircraft designed for altitude rather than agility. They had to learn to navigate by celestial observation when operating above the range of conventional navigation aids. They had to develop the patience to fly straight and level for hours, maintaining precise courses that allowed the cameras to capture useful imagery. The training program was based at Area 51, far from curious eyes. Candidate pilots would arrive at Groom Lake not knowing exactly what they would be flying, only that it was important and dangerous. They were evaluated not just on their flying abilities, but on their temperament, their discretion, their capacity to function under stress without seeking support from outside the program. Those who made it through training joined an elite fraternity. They knew things their peers in the conventional Air Force couldn't imagine. They flew higher than any other pilots in history, and they couldn't tell a soul. The cockpit was cramped and uncomfortable. Pilots wore pressure suits, similar to what astronauts would later use, because at 70,000 feet, an unprotected human would die within seconds from decompression. The suits were bulky and restrictive, making even simple movements difficult. Long missions meant hours of discomfort, with no ability to scratch an itch or shift position. At that altitude, the U-2 would be untouchable, or so everyone hoped. But building such an aircraft was only half the challenge. Where could it be tested? The U-2's existence had to remain absolutely secret. If the Soviets learned about the program, they would immediately begin developing countermeasures. The plane couldn't be tested at any established airbase where curious civilians or enemy spies might observe it. It needed somewhere truly remote, somewhere that didn't officially exist. In the spring of 1955, Richard Bissell, the CIA officer directing what was called Project Aquatone, flew over the Nevada desert with Kelly Johnson, searching for a suitable location. They passed over the Nevada test site, following the restricted airspace until Johnson spotted the dry lake bed at Groom Lake gleaming in the afternoon sun. Bissell later recalled how Johnson practically bounced in his seat with excitement. The lake bed was perfect, a natural runway that could be extended with minimal construction. The surrounding mountains provided natural barriers to observation, and the proximity to the nuclear test site meant the airspace was already restricted, reducing the chances of accidental discovery. The pilots circled lower, and Johnson studied the terrain with an engineer's eye. The lakebed surface was hard-packed, capable of supporting aircraft without the need for paved runways. The approaches were clear of obstructions. Fresh water could be obtained from nearby wells. It wasn't comfortable, but it would work. Within weeks, President Eisenhower personally approved the establishment of a secret facility at Groom Lake. The Atomic Energy Commission agreed to add the area to the test site on paper, though in reality it would be operated entirely by the CIA and Lockheed. The location received a bureaucratic designation based on old grid maps of the region, Area 51. Some have speculated about the number's significance, wondering if it held some special meaning. The reality is more mundane. The Nevada test site was divided into numbered areas for administrative purposes, and this particular grid square happened to be number 51. There was no mystical significance, just the alphabet soup of government mapping conventions. But Johnson, ever the salesman, came up with a different name to help recruit workers to this remote and inhospitable place. He called it Paradise Ranch. The name was, of course, a joke. There was nothing remotely paradisiacal about Groom Lake in the summer of 1955. Temperatures regularly exceeded 100 degrees. Dust storms could arise without warning, reducing visibility to nothing. The nearest hint of civilization was the tiny settlement of Rachel, population barely 50 miles away down an unpaved road. The landscape was beautiful in its own harsh way, but it was a beauty that required endurance to appreciate. The mountains turned purple and gold at sunset. The stars at night were spectacular, undiminished by any light pollution. Coyotes howled in the darkness, and the occasional jackrabbit bounded across the cracked earth. But during the day there was nothing but sun and heat and dust, endless dust that worked its way into everything. But the name stuck. Workers began calling themselves ranch hands, embracing the absurdity of the moniker, even as they labored in conditions that would make most people quit within a week. The first construction crews arrived in the spring and worked at a furious pace. By July, they had laid a 5,000-foot runway on the lakebed surface, erected 3 basic hangars, and built a small cluster of support buildings. The accommodations were Spartan in the extreme. Metal trailers for sleeping quarters, a converted mess hall, a primitive movie theater where 16mm films could be shown on occasional evenings. There was a volleyball court, too. In the murderous desert heat, after days of back-breaking classified work, the men would gather in the relative cool of the evening to play volleyball by the light of temporary flood lamps. It sounds almost quaint now, but these small comforts mattered enormously to people living in such isolation. The secrecy was absolute from the very beginning. Workers were told only what they needed to know for their specific jobs. Most had no idea what kind of aircraft they were helping to build, much less its intended purpose. They couldn't call home to tell their families where they were. They couldn't mention the location to friends. Many simply disappeared from their normal lives for weeks or months at a time, returning with nothing but vague explanations about government work and faces weathered by the desert sun. The recruitment process itself was an exercise in discretion. Candidates were approached quietly, often through existing professional networks. They were asked if they would be willing to work on a classified project in a remote location for an extended period. No details were provided until they had agreed and passed extensive background checks. Even then, they learned only what was necessary for their specific roles. For the pilots and engineers at the heart of the U-2 program, life at Paradise Ranch was a study in contradiction. They were doing extraordinary work, pushing the boundaries of aviation in ways that would change history, but they couldn't tell anyone. Their achievements had to remain locked inside, shared only with the handful of colleagues cleared to know the truth. Imagine carrying that weight. Imagine designing an aircraft that could photograph Soviet missile sites from the edge of space, successfully testing it over the Nevada desert, and then going home to tell your wife you'd had a boring week at the office. The psychological toll of such sustained secrecy is difficult to fully comprehend, yet thousands of Americans lived with it for years, sometimes for decades. The weight of classified knowledge affects people differently. Some compartmentalize effectively, maintaining strict boundaries between their work lives and personal lives. They develop the ability to switch off when they walk through their front doors, to be fully present with families who have no idea what occupies their days. Others struggle with the constant deception, feeling that they're lying to the people they love most, even if by omission rather than commission. Psychologists who have studied classified workers report elevated rates of stress-related conditions, though the research itself is limited by the very secrecy it attempts to examine. How do you study the psychological effects of secrecy when the subjects can't tell you what they're keeping secret? The paradox is inherent in the phenomenon itself. The marriages of Area 51 workers faced unique strains. Spouses would notice unexplained absences, vague answers to simple questions, long silences where conversations should have been. Some assumed infidelity, a suspicion that was almost impossible to refute without revealing classified information. Others developed a kind of acceptance, learning not to ask questions, filling the gaps with trust rather than understanding. Children of these workers grew up in households where certain topics were simply never discussed. Dad's work was important, they were told, and that was all they needed to know. Some accepted this explanation without question. Others spent years wondering what their fathers did, constructing elaborate theories that were sometimes more dramatic than the truth, and sometimes less so. The secrecy extended even to death. When a pilot or engineer died in a classified accident, the family might receive only the most generic notification. They couldn't be told where the accident occurred, what caused it, or even what project their loved one had been working on. Memorial services were held without the context that might have made them meaningful. The deceased were buried with their secrets intact. And yet, for most of those involved, the sacrifice felt worthwhile. They believed they were protecting their country during its most dangerous hour. The Soviet Union wasn't a theoretical threat, it was an existential one, capable of ending American civilization in a single afternoon. Every test flight, every technical breakthrough, every piece of intelligence gathered from the aircraft they built contributed to preventing that catastrophe. The first U-2 flights over the Nevada desert began in August of 1955. The test program proceeded with remarkable speed, driven by the urgency of Cold War requirements. The test program proceeded with remarkable speed, driven by the urgency of Cold War requirements. Each flight pushed the envelope further, testing the aircraft's limits, refining its systems, training the pilots who would eventually fly it over hostile territory. The plane performed beyond expectations, soaring to altitudes that seemed impossible, its cameras capturing images of the ground with stunning clarity. From 70,000 feet, the photographs could reveal individual aircraft parked on runways, count trucks on roads, identify the types of missiles being prepared for launch. By the following summer, U-2s were making their first reconnaissance flights over the Soviet Union, photographing military bases, airfields, and the emerging Soviet missile program. These missions were incredibly dangerous, not just because of the potential for being shot down, but because of the diplomatic consequences if a plane were lost. Eisenhower authorized the flights reluctantly, knowing that discovery could trigger an international crisis. The intelligence gathered was invaluable. For the first time, American planners had hard evidence about Soviet capabilities. The bomber gap, it turned out, had been greatly exaggerated. The Soviets had far fewer long-range bombers than feared. This knowledge alone may have prevented catastrophic miscalculations during the tensest years of the Cold War. But something unexpected was also happening. As U-2 flights increased over the American Southwest, reports of unidentified flying objects began flooding into military and civilian authorities. Airline pilots flying coast to coast at dusk would spot something strange. A brilliant fiery disk high above them, traveling at impossible speeds, reflecting the setting sun in ways that made it seem to glow with internal light. The U-2, you see, flew so high that it could catch the sun's rays long after sunset had reached the ground below. Its silver wings would blaze with reflected light against the darkening sky, appearing to civilian pilots as something otherworldly. Commercial aircraft of that era rarely exceeded 40,000 feet. The idea that any plane could be cruising at 70,000 feet was simply beyond comprehension for most people, including experienced aviators. Consider what these pilots were seeing. They were flying westward in the early evening, with the sun setting ahead of them. Below, darkness was falling on the earth. But far above, at altitudes they didn't know any aircraft could reach, the U-2 was still bathed in sunlight, its reflective surfaces catching the rays and throwing them back in a dazzling display. It would appear to be glowing from within, a fiery disk moving at speeds that seemed impossible. These sightings created an awkward problem for the Air Force. The witnesses were credible professionals, not cranks or attention seekers. Their observations were accurate. Something truly was up there, doing things no known aircraft could do. But the Air Force couldn't simply explain that the sightings were American spy planes. The U-2 program remained classified at the highest levels, so the official responses were vague and unsatisfying. Natural phenomena, weather balloons, temperature inversions creating visual distortions, anything but the truth, and with each evasive answer, public suspicion grew. If the government wouldn't provide a clear explanation, perhaps there wasn't one to give. Perhaps these really were visitors from somewhere else entirely. The seed of the alien mythology had been planted, not by any actual extraterrestrial presence, but by the government's own need to protect its secrets. As the 1950s gave way to the 60s, Paradise Ranch continued to evolve. The U-2 program was by then well established, but the Soviets had demonstrated a troubling capability in May of 1960 when they shot down Francis Gary Powers over Russia. The U-2 was no longer invulnerable. Something faster and higher was needed. Powers had been flying a routine reconnaissance mission over Soviet territory when a surface-to-air missile exploded near his aircraft, damaging it severely enough that he couldn't maintain altitude. He ejected safely, but was captured by Soviet forces. The resulting diplomatic crisis was exactly what Eisenhower had feared. The Soviets paraded Powers before the world, displaying the wreckage of his aircraft and the sophisticated cameras it had carried. The incident demonstrated that the Soviets had developed missile technology capable of reaching even the extraordinary altitudes at which the U-2 operated. A new solution was needed, something even faster and higher flying than Kelly Johnson's masterpiece. Powers himself became a prisoner of the Cold War, held by the Soviets for nearly 2 years before being exchanged for a captured Soviet spy in a tense handover at the Glienicke Bridge in Berlin. The bridge would later become famous as the Bridge of Spies, immortalized in film and literature. But at the time, Powers' release was simply one more chapter in the endless chess game between superpowers. The shootdown had immediate and far-reaching consequences. Overflights of the Soviet Union were suspended indefinitely. The diplomatic damage took years to repair, and in the hangars at Groom Lake, engineers redoubled their efforts on a successor aircraft that might be fast enough and high enough to survive in the new threat environment. That something was already being developed in the hangars at Groom Lake. Project Oxcart, as it was known, would produce the A-12 reconnaissance aircraft, predecessor to the legendary SR-71 Blackbird. This new plane would fly at more than 3 times the speed of sound. At altitudes exceeding 90,000 feet, it could cross the continental United States in little more than an hour. It was, simply put, the most advanced aircraft ever created. The name Oxcart seems incongruous for such a sophisticated machine. The slow, plodding image of a cart pulled by oxen couldn't be more different from an aircraft capable of outrunning missiles. But that was precisely the point. In the world of classified programs, innocuous names were preferred, anything that might mislead an adversary who happened to intercept a document mentioning the project. The engineering challenges were staggering. At Mach 3, air friction heats an aircraft's skin to temperatures that would melt aluminum. The leading edges of the wings could reach 600 degrees Fahrenheit during sustained supersonic flight. Conventional aircraft materials simply couldn't survive such conditions. Lockheed engineers had to develop new materials and manufacturing techniques just to build a plane that could survive its own speed. They settled on titanium, a metal that was incredibly strong and heat-resistant, but notoriously difficult to work with. The CIA had to establish secret channels to purchase titanium from the only country that had enough supply, the Soviet Union. Through a complex web of shell companies and intermediaries, American agents bought Soviet titanium and shipped it back to the United States, where it was fabricated into an aircraft designed to spy on the very nation that had provided the raw materials. The Soviets never knew. The A-12 required a massive expansion of the Groom Lake facility. In 1960, crews poured a new runway more than 8,000 feet long, with an additional extension onto the lakebed itself. New hangars went up, larger and more sophisticated than before. Housing improved from trailers to actual dormitory-style buildings. The mess hall was upgraded, staffed by professional chefs lured away from Las Vegas restaurants with the promise of generous pay and absolute secrecy about their workplace. James Nose, one of the contractors who worked at Area 51 during this period, later recalled the food with particular fondness. "Day or night," he said, "you could get a steak, whatever you wanted." In the middle of the Nevada desert, surrounded by nothing but sagebrush and sand, world-class chefs prepared meals that wouldn't have been out of place in a fine Vegas hotel. It was one of the small compensations for the isolation and the inability to speak about anything that happened at work. The chefs themselves were selected as carefully as any engineer. They had to be trustworthy, discreet, willing to live and work in isolation without asking questions. They cooked for hundreds of workers without ever knowing what those workers actually did, all day. The separation was maintained rigorously. Kitchen staff saw workers come and go, in coveralls heading to hangars they were forbidden to approach, returning tired and tight-lipped. One chef later recalled the surreal experience of preparing meals in the middle of the Nevada desert. He had trained at fine dining establishments in San Francisco, worked his way up through prestigious kitchens, and then found himself cooking steaks for engineers who couldn't tell him what they were engineering. The money was excellent, the benefits generous, and the silence absolute. He learned to ask no questions and to be satisfied with no answers. The support staff at Area 51 formed their own community within the larger secret world. Maintenance workers, security guards, administrative personnel, medical staff, All of them cleared for access to the facility, but not necessarily cleared for the details of what happened in the hangars. They developed their own rhythms, their own jokes, their own ways of coping with the strangeness of their daily lives. The medical team faced particular challenges. What do you do when an engineer is injured in an accident involving classified equipment? The injury itself might reveal something about what was being built. Doctors and nurses learned to treat wounds without asking how they occurred, to document symptoms without speculating about causes. They became expert at providing care, while maintaining willful ignorance of context. Security at the facility was handled with extraordinary care. Guards were positioned at checkpoints throughout the complex, verifying credentials and monitoring movement. Even within Area 51, access was compartmentalized. A worker cleared for Hangar 3 might be turned away from Hangar 4. Everyone was on a need-to-know basis, and the definition of need was narrow indeed. The A-12 itself was a marvel of engineering that still seems ahead of its time today. Its titanium airframe had to withstand temperatures hot enough to soften aluminum. Its distinctive shape, with the long fuselage and curved surfaces, was designed to reduce radar reflection decades before stealth technology became a common term. Even the dark paint wasn't ordinary black, but a special coating that helped radiate heat away from the aircraft's skin during supersonic flight. When the first complete A-12 arrived at Groom Lake in early 1962, it came in pieces, disassembled at the Lockheed plant in Burbank and loaded onto specially designed trailers that cost nearly $100,000 each. The components were transported at night, covered by canvas shrouds, along routes cleared of any traffic that might catch a glimpse of what was being moved. The logistics were extraordinary. Bridges along the route had to be checked to ensure they could handle the weight. Sharp turns were impossible with such a long trailer, so routes had to be planned to avoid them. Police escorts cleared the highways without knowing what they were escorting. Anyone who asked was told it was construction equipment, and most people accepted that explanation without further thought. Reassembly took place inside the hangars, and the aircraft didn't emerge until it was ready for taxi tests on the lakebed runway. The secrecy extended to extraordinary lengths. The Federal Aviation Administration director was personally briefed on the program, not because he needed to know the details, but so he could quietly instruct air traffic controllers to handle any unusual sightings with discretion. When pilots reported strange aircraft at impossible altitudes, controllers were told to file written reports rather than discuss the sightings over the radio. The reports would find their way to CIA analysts, who would verify that the sighting matched an A-12 test flight and then file the information away, satisfied that no actual UFO was involved. The process created an elaborate paper trail of explained sightings, each one attributed to some innocuous cause that concealed the true nature of what witnesses had seen. Weather phenomena. Experimental aircraft, technically true but deliberately vague. Optical illusions caused by atmospheric conditions. The explanations accumulated, and anyone who studied them carefully might have noticed that the Air Force seemed remarkably confident in its mundane explanations for things that trained pilots swore were extraordinary. The investigators at Project Blue Book developed a kind of professional skepticism that bordered on reflexive dismissal. Their job, as they understood it, was to explain sightings, not to validate them. Every case closed with a mundane explanation was a success. Every case that remained unexplained was a failure. This institutional incentive shaped how they approached their work, sometimes leading them to accept explanations that didn't quite fit the evidence. But the investigators weren't fools, and some of the cases they examined genuinely puzzled them. Multiple radar returns confirmed by visual sightings, objects tracked by separate systems moving at speeds no known aircraft could achieve, trained observers describing phenomena they couldn't explain, their accounts consistent in details that hoaxers wouldn't think to coordinate. The Washington, D.C. sightings of 1952 were particularly troubling. Over several nights in July of that year, radar operators tracked unknown objects over the nation's capital. Fighter jets were scrambled to intercept, but the objects seemed to disappear whenever aircraft approached, only to reappear elsewhere. The incident made national headlines and prompted urgent questions from Congress. Blue Book investigated and eventually attributed the sightings to temperature inversions, atmospheric layers that could create false radar returns. The explanation was technically plausible but left many unsatisfied. Temperature inversions don't typically produce consistent returns over multiple nights, and they certainly don't explain the visual sightings that accompanied the radar contacts. But the reports kept coming, and they grew stranger with each passing year. The A-12's unusual shape, combined with its incredible performance, made it unlike anything witnesses had ever seen. The aircraft could accelerate so quickly that it seemed to disappear. It could turn at angles that would tear a conventional plane apart. When seen from below, its disc-like fuselage and the distortion caused by its wake of superheated air made it appear almost otherworldly. Later estimates by CIA officials who worked on both the U-2 and A-12 programs suggested that more than half of all UFO reports during the late 1950s and throughout the 1960s could be attributed to these classified aircraft. More than half. Consider what that means. Thousands of sightings, dutifully investigated by Air Force officers who knew perfectly well what people were seeing but couldn't say so. Thousands of witnesses left wondering what they had glimpsed in the sky. Thousands of questions that couldn't be answered without revealing national secrets. The alternative explanation, that alien spacecraft were visiting Earth, began to seem almost reasonable by comparison. At least it was an explanation, even if it was the wrong one. The elaborate deceptions at Area 51 extended beyond simple secrecy into outright theater. Workers developed what they called hooting and scooting, a procedure for hiding aircraft from Soviet reconnaissance satellites whose orbits were predictable. When a satellite was approaching overhead, crews would rush to move aircraft into hangars, wait for the satellite to pass, then move them back out again. But even that wasn't enough. Engineers discovered that the shadows cast by parked aircraft left thermal signatures on the desert floor, visible in infrared photography even after the aircraft had been moved. The ground cooled at different rates where a plane had blocked the sun, creating a ghost image that satellites could detect. The solution was almost comically low-tech. Crews began building fake aircraft out of cardboard and plywood, positioning them around the facility to cast misleading shadows. Soviet analysts studying satellite imagery would see the decoys and draw conclusions about American capabilities that had nothing to do with what was actually being tested at Groom Lake. The deception worked both ways. The Soviets knew something was happening in the Nevada desert. Their satellites photographed the base regularly, watching the construction expand year by year. But they couldn't determine what was being tested there. The combination of physical concealment, false leads, and strict security kept the A-12's existence secret for years. Life for the workers at Paradise Ranch during the early 60s settled into a peculiar rhythm. Most commuted daily from Las Vegas, a journey that was itself extraordinary. They would arrive at a private terminal at McCarran Airport, flash their identification badges to unsmiling guards, and board unmarked aircraft that flew under the call sign Janet. The flights departed early each morning, delivering workers to the dusty airstrip at Groom Lake, and returned each evening to bring them home. The Janet flights still operate today, Boeing 737s with no airline markings and windows covered with shades. They depart from a restricted terminal at Las Vegas and fly to destinations that officially don't exist. Plane spotters have tracked them for years, charting their routes, noting their schedules, piecing together fragments of information about operations that remain classified decades later. Some workers, particularly those on critical projects, remained at the site for weeks at a time. For them, the isolation was more profound. There was no phone access for personal calls. Mail was screened both coming and going. Entertainment consisted of whatever could be provided within the compound itself. The small movie theater, the recreational facilities, occasional games of volleyball or poker. Yet there was also a sense of purpose that bound these people together. They knew, even if they couldn't discuss it openly, that they were doing something important. The aircraft they built and tested were protecting the nation, providing intelligence that could mean the difference between peace and catastrophe. That knowledge sustained them through the long hours, the desert heat, the crushing weight of secrets they carried everywhere they went. One former worker described the camaraderie in terms that sound almost nostalgic.
"We were a family out there," he said.
We couldn't talk about what we did with anyone else, so we talked about it with each other. We argued about technical problems over dinner. We celebrated breakthroughs late into the night. We mourned together when things went wrong. Nobody else could understand what our lives were like, so we relied on each other completely. The tight-knit community at Area 51 faced moments of crisis that tested that solidarity. On May 24, 1963, an A-12 designated Article 123 crashed near Wendover, Utah, after the aircraft stalled during a test flight. The pilot ejected safely, but a highly classified piece of American technology was now scattered across Utah farmland. The response was swift and comprehensive. Within hours, recovery crews from Groom Lake had converged on the crash site. They arrived in unmarked vehicles, carrying equipment to collect every piece of debris, no matter how small. They told curious locals that a generic Air Force plane had gone down. Nothing to see here, move along. They worked through the night, loading wreckage into trucks, raking the desert soil to find the smallest fragments. By morning, the crash site was clean. Not a scrap of titanium remained to hint at what kind of aircraft had fallen from the sky. The official record noted only that a training flight had ended in an accident, with no injuries reported. The true nature of Article 123 remained classified for decades. Such incidents were the dark side of life at Paradise Ranch. The experimental aircraft being tested there pushed the very limits of what was physically possible. Pilots knew, every time they climbed into a cockpit, that they might not come home. Engineers knew that their designs, no matter how carefully calculated, might fail in ways nobody had anticipated. The margin for error was essentially zero. Several pilots died during the testing programs at Area 51. Their names were kept out of the press. Their families were told only that they had been lost in the service of their country, without details about where or how. The grief of their colleagues had to be processed in private, shared only among those cleared to know the truth. And still the work continued, because the Cold War showed no signs of ending, and the need for intelligence only grew more urgent with each passing year. While American engineers were developing spy planes at Groom Lake, another secret program was unfolding in the same hangars. This one involved aircraft that were never designed in the United States at all. Throughout the 1960s, the military and intelligence agencies worked to acquire examples of Soviet fighter aircraft by any means necessary. The goal was straightforward: to understand exactly what American pilots might face in combat, to find weaknesses that could be exploited, and to develop tactics that would give the United States an edge in any future conflict. The methods of acquisition varied. Some aircraft came from defectors who flew their planes to the West, seeking asylum and bringing their machines with them. Others were obtained through arrangements with foreign governments that had purchased Soviet equipment and were willing to share examples with American intelligence. A few, rumor has it, were acquired through even more clandestine means. In 1968, a particularly significant aircraft arrived at Groom Lake. An Iraqi Air Force pilot named Munir Redfar had defected to Israel, flying his MiG-21 across the border in a daring escape. The story of his defection was itself remarkable. Redfar was a Christian in an Iraqi military that treated religious minorities with suspicion. He had grown disillusioned with the regime and its endless conflicts. Through intermediaries, he made contact with Israeli intelligence, which offered him asylum and a substantial sum of money in exchange for bringing his aircraft with him. The escape required careful planning. Redfar had to convince his superiors to assign him a fully fueled aircraft. He had to time his flight to reach Israeli airspace before anyone realized what was happening. He had to trust that Israeli fighters, notoriously aggressive toward unidentified aircraft approaching their borders, would recognize him and hold their fire. The operation succeeded. Redfar crossed into Israeli airspace, was met by Israeli fighters and landed safely. The MiG-21 was immediately examined by Israeli engineers who found it to be a formidable fighting machine with capabilities that exceeded Western estimates. The Israelis, after thoroughly examining the aircraft themselves, agreed to loan it to the United States for further study. The MiG was crated up, shipped across the Atlantic, and eventually reassembled in the hangars at Groom Lake. Project Have Donut, as the American program was called, brought together pilots and engineers from both the Air Force and Navy to systematically evaluate the Soviet fighter. The tests took place over the Nevada desert, in the restricted airspace that workers had nicknamed Red Square, a tongue-in-cheek reference to the famous plaza in Moscow. What the American pilots discovered during these tests was both reassuring and sobering. The MiG-21 was a formidable aircraft, fast and maneuverable, capable of giving any American fighter a serious challenge. But it also had weaknesses. Its fuel consumption was high, limiting its range. Its cockpit visibility was poor compared to American designs. Its gun system had reliability issues under certain conditions. Most importantly, the tests revealed that the MiG fought differently than American aircraft. It had different strengths and different weaknesses. Tactics that worked against American opponents were useless against the MiG, and vice versa. The implications for the war in Vietnam, then raging halfway around the world, were profound. American pilots were facing MiGs in combat, and troublingly, were not achieving the kill ratios that had been expected. The exchange rates were closer to even than anyone in the military brass wanted to admit. The Have Donut tests helped explain why. When Air Force and Navy pilots first flew against the captured MiG at Groom Lake, the results were discouraging. Pilot after pilot found himself outmaneuvered, outflown, unable to gain advantage against the Soviet machine. The problem, it turned out, wasn't the American aircraft. It was the American tactics. The pilots who flew at Red Square had never faced anything like a MiG. They had trained against other American aircraft, learned to exploit weaknesses that simply didn't exist in the Soviet design. When confronted with an enemy that fought differently, they were at a loss. The solution was revolutionary. The Navy, spurred by the findings from Groom Lake, established a new training program to teach pilots how to fight against dissimilar aircraft. They called it the Navy Fighter Weapons School, but it quickly acquired a nickname that would become famous: Top Gun. The school's founding was remarkably humble, given the legend it would become. A small cadre of experienced pilots, many of whom had flown against the captured MiGs at Area 51, developed a curriculum focused on aggressive tactics and realistic combat scenarios. The training was intense, with instructors flying captured or simulated enemy aircraft against students who had to learn to win or face the consequences of failure. What made Top Gun revolutionary wasn't just the tactics it taught, but the culture it created. Students were encouraged to push limits, to question assumptions, to develop intuitive understanding of aerial combat that went beyond any manual or procedure. They flew multiple engagements every day, debriefing each one in excruciating detail, learning from mistakes that in actual combat would have been fatal. The instructors themselves were extraordinary pilots, chosen for their skill and their ability to push students to their limits. Some had actual combat experience from Vietnam. Others had spent countless hours flying against MiGs at Groom Lake, developing an intimate understanding of how the Soviet aircraft performed. They brought that knowledge to their teaching, showing students not just what a MiG could do, but how it felt to fight one. The school trained pilots using aircraft that could simulate MiG performance characteristics. Instructors taught aggressive tactics designed specifically to exploit Soviet weaknesses. Graduates returned to their squadrons with skills their predecessors had never possessed. The training emphasized that killing wasn't enough. Survival was equally important. A pilot who shot down one enemy but got killed doing it was a failure. The goal was to win every engagement while coming home to fight again. This philosophy required discipline, awareness, and a willingness to disengage when the odds turned unfavorable. The results were dramatic. Before Top Gun, Navy pilots were achieving kill ratios in Vietnam of barely 2 to 1. Afterwards, that ratio climbed to more than 8 to 1. The training program, developed in direct response to what was learned at Area 51, fundamentally transformed American air combat doctrine. The Air Force, notably, did not establish a similar program until years later. During that gap, Air Force kill ratios improved only marginally. The disparity became a source of intense inter-service rivalry and, eventually, reform. But the lesson from Groom Lake had been clear. Understanding your enemy's capabilities was essential to defeating them. The Soviet aircraft program at Area 51 continued for years, eventually involving multiple types of MiGs and other Eastern Bloc aircraft. Each one was studied exhaustively, flown by American pilots, tested to its limits. The knowledge gained saved countless lives in conflicts from Vietnam to the Gulf War and beyond. But like everything else at Paradise Ranch, the program remained classified. The pilots who flew enemy aircraft over the Nevada desert received no public recognition. The engineers who analyzed Soviet technology and developed countermeasures worked in anonymity. Their contributions to American air supremacy would not be acknowledged for decades. While extraordinary work was happening in the hangars and over the skies of Groom Lake, a very different drama was playing out in Washington, in the press, and in the American imagination. The unidentified flying object phenomenon had become too prominent to ignore. Thousands of reports were flooding into military authorities every year. Some came from credible witnesses: airline pilots, military personnel, law enforcement officers. The reports described objects performing maneuvers that seemed to defy the laws of physics, accelerating instantaneously, turning at impossible angles, hovering silently before vanishing at incredible speed. In response, the Air Force had established a series of programs to investigate these sightings. Project Sign came first in 1947, then Project Grudge, and finally in 1952, Project Blue Book, which would continue until 1969 and become the most extensive official investigation of UFOs ever conducted. The genesis of Project Blue Book lay in a series of events that had captured public attention. On June 24, 1947, a private pilot named Kenneth Arnold was flying near Mount Rainier in Washington state when he spotted 9 unusual objects moving at extraordinary speed in formation. Arnold described their motion as like saucers skipping across water, and a newspaper reporter coined the term flying saucer to describe them. Arnold's sighting was followed by hundreds of others across the country. The military received so many reports that it couldn't simply ignore them. What if these objects were Soviet aircraft, advanced beyond anything American intelligence had predicted? What if they represented a threat to national security that the country couldn't afford to dismiss? Blue Book was headquartered at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio, far from the Nevada desert. Its stated mission was twofold: to determine whether UFOs represented a threat to national security and to analyze UFO reports using scientific methods. Over the course of 17 years, Blue Book investigated more than 12,000 reported sightings. The vast majority were explained as misidentifications of conventional phenomena: weather balloons, satellites, aircraft, unusual cloud formations, Venus, which can appear startlingly bright under certain atmospheric conditions. One by one, the mundane explanations accumulated and the files grew thick with debunked reports. But not all of them. 701 sightings remained officially unexplained, even after rigorous analysis. They involved multiple witnesses, often with military or aviation backgrounds. The observations were consistent and detailed. The objects displayed characteristics that couldn't be attributed to any known aircraft or natural phenomenon. What the public didn't know, and wouldn't learn for decades, was that many of the explained sightings were explained by something the Air Force couldn't reveal. When Blue Book investigators needed to determine whether a reported UFO might be a classified American aircraft, they contacted the CIA's U-2 and Oxcart project offices. If the sighting matched a test flight, the case was closed with a generic explanation, and the true cause was never disclosed. This process worked efficiently from an intelligence standpoint, but it had unintended consequences. Every evasive answer, every vague explanation, Every suggestion that witnesses had simply misidentified ordinary objects fed public suspicion that something was being hidden, just not what the public imagined. J. Allen Hynek, the astronomer who served as Blue Book's scientific consultant for its entire existence, grew increasingly frustrated with the program's direction. Hynek had started as a skeptic, dismissing UFO reports as the products of overwrought imagination or misidentification. But year after year of investigating, he found cases that couldn't be easily explained away. The witnesses were too credible, the observations too consistent, the phenomena too strange to attribute to weather balloons or Venus. Hynek would later become an advocate for serious scientific study of UFOs, coining the term close encounters to categorize different types of sightings. But during the Blue Book years, he was constrained by the program's unofficial mission to explain away sightings rather than investigate them genuinely. The 1960s saw the UFO phenomenon reach fever pitch. Several major sighting waves occurred, including a dramatic series of reports from the Midwest and Southeast in the summer of 1965. Witnesses described multicolored lights, egg-shaped objects, and diamond-shaped craft performing impossible aerial acrobatics. The press covered the sightings extensively, congressional hearings were held. Pressure mounted for the government to provide real answers. In response, the Air Force commissioned a comprehensive study from the University of Colorado, led by physicist Edward Condon. The Condon Report, as it became known, was released in 1969. Its conclusion was definitive. No UFO sighting had ever represented a threat to national security, shown evidence of technology beyond human capability, or been proven to be of extraterrestrial origin. Based on these findings, the Air Force terminated Project Blue Book in December of that year. The official investigation was over, but the questions remained. The 701 unexplained cases were never resolved. The witnesses who had reported strange objects in the sky were never told what they had actually seen, and the mythology of government cover-ups and hidden truths only grew stronger. For the workers at Area 51, the UFO craze was a source of dark amusement and genuine frustration. They knew exactly what was flying over the Nevada desert. They had built it, tested it, refined it. Some of them had piloted the very aircraft that were being mistaken for alien spacecraft, and they couldn't say a word. Decades later, when some of these workers finally received clearance to discuss their experiences, they expressed a mixture of pride and exasperation. They were proud of what they had accomplished, the revolutionary aircraft that helped win the Cold War without a shot being fired. But they were exasperated by the public's obsession with aliens, the endless speculation about extraterrestrial technology hiding in their hangars. One veteran put it plainly, "This is Earth technology. American technology, built by American engineers and flown by American pilots." People keep talking about flying saucers from other planets when they should be talking about the incredible things their own countrymen achieved. But by then, the mythology had taken on a life of its own, and in 1989, it would receive its most influential boost yet. The story of how Area 51 became synonymous with alien conspiracy theories cannot be told without mentioning Bob Lazar. In May of that year, Lazar appeared on a Las Vegas television station, his face hidden, his voice disguised, claiming to have worked at a facility near Groom Lake on a project so secret that even mentioning it could cost him his life. Lazar's claims were extraordinary. He said he had been hired to help reverse engineer alien spacecraft at a site called S4, built into the mountainside near Papoose Lake, just south of Area 51. He described 9 flying saucers stored in underground hangars, vehicles of extraterrestrial origin that used an element unknown to earthly science, element 115, as their power source. According to Lazar, the propulsion systems worked by manipulating gravity itself, bending space and time around the craft to enable faster-than-light travel. He claimed to have read classified briefing documents describing alien involvement in human affairs stretching back thousands of years. He said he had personally worked on one of the saucers, attempting to understand how its reactor functioned. The story was electrifying. It combined everything that had been whispered about Area 51 for decades: government secrecy, advanced technology, extraterrestrial life, and a massive cover-up to keep the truth from the public. Within months, Lazar had become a celebrity in UFO circles, appearing on radio shows and in documentaries, elaborating on his account of life inside America's most secret facility. Investigators quickly began poking holes in Lazar's background. He claimed degrees from prestigious institutions, but neither MIT nor Caltech had any record of his attendance. He said he had worked at Los Alamos National Laboratory as a physicist, but employment records showed he had been a technician for a contracting company, not a scientist employed directly by the lab. His story contained inconsistencies and unsupported claims that skeptics seized upon. In an interesting twist, Element 115 was eventually synthesized by Russian scientists in 2003. The element, now called moscovium, exists only for fractions of a second before decaying. It has none of the stable, power-generating properties Lazar described. But its eventual discovery, after years of being dismissed as fictional, gave his supporters ammunition to argue that he had been telling the truth. Lazar's supporters argued that the government had deliberately erased his records to discredit him, which was precisely the kind of cover-up he claimed to be exposing. His detractors pointed out that claims requiring their own conspiracy theory to explain away contradicting evidence were, by definition, unfalsifiable. Whatever the truth about Bob Lazar himself, the impact of his story was undeniable. Before 1989, Area 51 was known mainly to military aviation enthusiasts and conspiracy theorists operating on the fringes. After Lazar's revelations, the base became a household name. It entered popular culture in ways that would have been unimaginable just a few years earlier. Movies and television shows featured thinly veiled versions of the site. Independence Day, released in 1996, depicted Area 51 as housing recovered alien spacecraft that proved crucial in defeating an extraterrestrial invasion. The X-Files built mythology around government cover-ups of alien activity. Countless other productions followed, each adding layers to the legend. Tourists began making pilgrimages to the Nevada desert, hoping to catch a glimpse of something unexplainable. The state of Nevada eventually designated the highway passing nearest to the base as the extraterrestrial highway, embracing the tourism dollars that alien hunters brought to the otherwise empty region. The tiny town of Rachel, population barely 50, became an unlikely destination for visitors from around the world. The transformation of Rachel was perhaps the strangest consequence of the Area 51 mythology. This speck of a community, originally founded to serve workers at a nearby mine, had little to distinguish it from dozens of other desert outposts, slowly dying as the modern economy passed them by. Then Bob Lazar told his story, and suddenly Rachel was famous. The road into town passed through some of the most desolate landscape in America. Miles of empty desert, punctuated only by Joshua trees and the occasional abandoned structure. Then, seemingly out of nowhere, signs began appearing. Alien crossing, UFO parking only. We don't call 911. The residents of Rachel, whatever they personally believed about flying saucers, had discovered a new industry. The Little Arle Inn, a small bar and restaurant in Rachel, became a gathering place for UFO enthusiasts. Its walls are covered with photographs of strange lights, newspaper clippings about sightings, and memorabilia from decades of alien hunting. The proprietors have heard every theory, met every type of true believer and skeptic. They serve burgers named after close encounters and sell souvenirs to visitors who have traveled thousands of miles to stand in the desert and wonder. In September of 2019, a Facebook event proposing to storm Area 51 went viral, attracting millions of sign-ups from people who were joking, or mostly joking, or perhaps not entirely joking, about rushing the gates to discover what the government was hiding. The actual event drew far fewer participants, but thousands did make the trip to Rachel, turning the tiny town into a surreal festival of alien-themed revelry. Local authorities had prepared for trouble. Military security increased visibly around the base perimeter, Deputies stood ready to arrest anyone foolish enough to actually cross the line. In the end, the Storm Area 51 event was more party than protest, more curiosity than confrontation, but it demonstrated the enduring hold that the base has on public imagination, the persistent belief that answers to cosmic questions might lie just beyond those warning signs. For the actual workers at Area 51, the attention was unwelcome. They were still doing classified work, still developing technologies that couldn't be discussed publicly, the crowds of curious visitors, the television cameras, the constant speculation about what was really happening behind the fences. All of it made their jobs more difficult and their security more complicated. Some felt personally insulted by the alien mythology. They had dedicated their careers to pushing the boundaries of human engineering, to creating aircraft that seemed impossible until American ingenuity made them real. To have their work attributed to extraterrestrial intervention felt like a dismissal of everything they had accomplished. And yet the mythology persisted. It persists to this day. As we drift toward the end of our journey tonight, let us consider what Area 51 really represents in American history and imagination. On one level, it is simply a military facility, no different in purpose from dozens of other classified installations scattered across the country. It exists to develop and test technologies that the nation's leaders believe are necessary for security. The secrecy surrounding it is the same secrecy that surrounds any sensitive military project designed to prevent adversaries from learning capabilities that might put American lives at risk. The workers who spent their careers there were not guarding alien secrets. They were engineers, pilots, technicians, and support staff doing difficult work in difficult conditions for causes they believed were just. They missed family events they couldn't explain. They carried knowledge they could never share. They watched the world speculate wildly about their workplace and couldn't correct the record. On another level, Area 51 has become something far larger than any physical location could be. It has become a symbol, a repository for all the questions that remain unanswered, all the suspicions that powerful institutions aren't telling us everything they know. The alien mythology is, in some ways, less about extraterrestrial life than about trust, or the lack of it, between citizens and their government. The irony is rich. The real secrets of Area 51, the ones that were actually hidden there for decades, were remarkable enough to justify the mystique. The U-2, the A-12, the captured Soviet aircraft, the breakthrough technologies that emerged from those desert hangars, these were genuine achievements worthy of wonder. But they couldn't be revealed without compromising national security, so the public filled the void with speculation. And the speculation, as speculation tends to do, grew more fantastical with each passing year. Today, we know many of the secrets that once made Area 51 the most classified location in America. Declassified documents have revealed the history of the spy plane programs. Former workers have shared their memories of life at Paradise Ranch. The CIA officially acknowledged the facility's existence in 2013, ending decades of official denial that there was anything at Groom Lake worth discussing. The declassification came through a Freedom of Information Act request filed in 2005 by Jeffrey Richelson, a researcher at George Washington University. For 8 years, Richelson waited while his request worked its way through the bureaucracy. When the documents finally arrived, they revealed what aviation historians had suspected for decades. Area 51 had been created to develop and test the U-2 spy plane, and later served as the testing ground for the A-12 and other classified aircraft. The release was significant not for what it revealed, since most of the information had been pieced together by researchers over the years, but for what it represented, an official acknowledgement that the facility existed and had a legitimate military purpose. The government was no longer pretending there was nothing at Groom Lake. The fig leaf had been removed. Media coverage of the declassification was extensive, though perhaps not quite what the UFO community had hoped. There were no revelations about alien spacecraft or recovered extraterrestrial technology. Instead, there were details about aircraft design, test flight schedules, and the elaborate measures taken to maintain secrecy. The truth, as so often happens, was more mundane than the mythology. For the workers who had spent careers at Area 51, the declassification brought relief and frustration in equal measure. They could finally discuss some of what they had done, share memories that had been locked away for decades. But they could only discuss the programs that had been declassified. Much remained secret, and the habits of a lifetime are not easily broken. But some secrets remain. Area 51 is still an active military installation. New construction is visible in satellite imagery, hangars and runways that weren't there decades ago. Aircraft still take off and land at odd hours, their missions known only to those with proper clearances. The warning signs still line the perimeter, and the guards still watch from their positions on the surrounding hills. Whatever is happening at Groom Lake today, it is almost certainly more mundane than flying saucers and alien autopsies. The reality of classified military research is usually less dramatic than fiction suggests. Long hours of testing, careful documentation, incremental improvements to existing technologies. But the veil of secrecy ensures that speculation will continue, that Area 51 will remain a canvas onto which people can project their hopes and fears about what the government might be hiding. Perhaps that's fitting. Perhaps every nation needs a place like this, a mystery that can never quite be solved, a reminder that the world is more complicated than the official explanations suggest. Area 51 serves that function beautifully, simultaneously real and mythological, a physical location and a state of mind. For the men and women who worked there across the decades, the legacy is more personal. They gave their careers to projects they couldn't discuss, missed family events they couldn't explain, carried secrets that weighed on them for years. Some are proud of what they accomplished. Others are frustrated that the truth has been obscured by fantasy. Most, presumably, feel some combination of both. James Nose, the contractor who could finally talk about his work after 47 years of silence, summed it up simply. "I was doing something for my country," he said. That's what mattered. The sun sets over the Nevada desert, much as it did in 1955, painting the mountains in shades of orange and purple, turning the Groom Lake Basin into a mirror for the evening sky. The aircraft that now fly from those runways are different than the ones Kelly Johnson designed, but the mission remains the same: to stay ahead of threats, to maintain capabilities that adversaries can only guess at, to do the work that shadows require. And somewhere in America tonight, there's probably an engineer working on something we can't imagine, a pilot testing an aircraft that officially doesn't exist, a researcher pushing boundaries in a laboratory that appears on no public map. The tradition continues, long after Paradise Ranch earned its ironic name. Thank you for spending this evening with me, dear friends. I hope the story of Area 51 has given you something to think about as you drift towards sleep. Not little green men or government conspiracies, but something perhaps more interesting: the remarkable things that human beings can accomplish when they set their minds to impossible tasks. If you enjoyed tonight's journey, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps bring more stories like this, one to listeners all around the world. And if you have thoughts about what you've heard or suggestions for future topics, leave a comment below. I read every one. Until next time, rest well. The mysteries can wait until morning. But before we part ways completely, let me share a few more thoughts that might accompany you into sleep. Throughout human history, governments have kept information hidden from their citizens. Sometimes this secrecy has been necessary and just, protecting lives and preserving advantages that keep nations safe. Other times it has been abused, covering up failures and misconduct that the public had every right to know about. Area 51 sits at the intersection of these realities. The secrecy surrounding the U-2 program genuinely saved lives. Had the Soviets learned about the aircraft's capabilities before it was deployed, they might have developed countermeasures that would have rendered American intelligence blind at a critical moment. The decision to keep the program classified, however frustrating for the public, was defensible. But that same secrecy fed suspicions that went far beyond what was justified. When the government said it wasn't hiding anything at Groom Lake, it was lying, not about aliens, but about something. And once trust is broken, Even for legitimate reasons, it becomes difficult to rebuild. The workers at Paradise Ranch understood this tension intimately. They were patriots, most of them, doing what they believed was necessary for their country. But they were also complicit in a culture of deception that extended far beyond their specific projects. Every time a UFO sighting was attributed to weather phenomena rather than a classified aircraft, another small fracture appeared in the relationship between government and governed. Perhaps that's the real lesson of Area 51. Secrecy has costs that extend beyond the immediate tactical advantages it provides. It breeds suspicion and conspiracy thinking. It creates gaps in the public record that imagination rushes to fill. It makes it harder for citizens to trust their institutions, even when those institutions are acting in good faith. The men and women who built the U-2 and the A-12 deserve to be remembered as heroes. They accomplished extraordinary things under impossible conditions, and their work helped prevent a hot war during the most dangerous period in human history. But the mythology that grew up around their workplace, the alien conspiracies and government cover-ups, that too is part of their legacy, not because they created it, but because the secrecy surrounding their work made it possible. Think about the pilots who flew those early test flights, climbing to altitudes where no human had ever traveled in powered flight. They wore pressure suits that barely kept them alive, flew aircraft that were still experimental, and returned to a base that officially didn't exist. When something went wrong, and things did go wrong, there was no emergency infrastructure, no nearby hospital, no fire department to call. Just the desert and their colleagues and whatever makeshift arrangements could be improvised. Think about the families who waited at home, not knowing where their loved ones were or what they were doing. The wives who couldn't ask questions, the children who grew up with fathers who were present but somehow absent, always carrying the weight of things they couldn't share. The reunions that must have been complicated by everything that couldn't be said. Think about the engineers who spent years perfecting technologies that they would never be publicly credited for developing. In any other context, their achievements would have earned them recognition, awards, maybe even fame. Instead, they worked in anonymity, their contributions known only to the small circle of colleagues who shared their clearances. The human cost of secrecy is difficult to measure but impossible to ignore. It manifests in strained relationships, in missed milestones, in the quiet loneliness of carrying knowledge that sets you apart from everyone you love. The workers at Area 51 paid that cost willingly, believing the cause was worth the sacrifice. But it was a sacrifice nonetheless. And what of the public fascination with aliens? Why does the idea of extraterrestrial visitors hold such enduring appeal? Perhaps it speaks to something deep in the human psyche, a longing for contact with something larger than ourselves. Throughout history, people have looked to the skies and wondered whether we're alone in the universe. The vastness of space suggests that other intelligent beings must exist somewhere, and the possibility that they might have visited Earth provides a comforting sense that the cosmos is not empty and indifferent. Or perhaps the alien mythology serves a different function, providing a framework for thinking about power and secrecy in ways that feel manageable. If the government is hiding alien technology, at least there's a reason for all the classified programs and restricted areas and need-to-know protocols. The alternative, that secrecy is simply how power operates, that vast institutions routinely conceal information for reasons that have nothing to do with cosmic significance, might be harder to accept. The UFO phenomenon has evolved considerably since the 1950s and 60s. What was once dismissed as fringe thinking has gained a measure of mainstream respectability. The Pentagon has acknowledged studying unidentified aerial phenomena. Congressional hearings have featured testimony from military pilots describing encounters with objects that seem to defy explanation. The conversation has shifted from whether UFOs exist to what they might be. None of this proves that aliens have visited Earth, or that Area 51 houses recovered spacecraft, but it does suggest that the questions raised by generations of witnesses and researchers have not been satisfactorily answered. Something is happening in our skies that military officials take seriously enough to investigate. What it is remains unclear. For those who worked at Groom Lake during the Cold War years, The recent surge of interest in UFOs must be a strange experience. They know what they were testing in the Nevada desert. They know how many sightings were explained, at least in classified files, by aircraft they helped build. And they know that the alien mythology, however compelling to the public, had nothing to do with their daily reality of engineering challenges and test flights and the endless pursuit of technological advantage. But they also know that they couldn't tell the whole truth, and that the partial truths and outright deceptions of their era contributed to the confusion that persists today. The seeds planted decades ago continue to bear fruit, for better and worse. Let us close with one final image. It's evening in the Nevada desert, sometime in the early 1960s. The sun has just set, and the first stars are appearing in the darkening sky. A lone aircraft climbs from the runway at Groom Lake, its engine screaming as it reaches for the edge of space. Inside the cockpit, a pilot in a pressure suit watches the sky turn from purple to black. Below him, the lights of the base dwindle to a scatter of fireflies. Below that, the desert stretches in every direction, empty and ancient and utterly indifferent to human concerns. The pilot doesn't know it, but hundreds of miles away, an airline crew is watching his aircraft catch the last rays of the sun. To them, it looks like something from another world, a fiery disk moving at impossible speeds. They'll report what they saw when they land. The report will make its way through official channels. It will be explained away as temperature inversions, or Venus, or experimental aircraft without any specifics. And the mystery will continue, as it always does, because some truths are too important to share, and some lies are told in service of larger goods, and the line between them is never quite as clear as we'd like it to be. The pilot continues to climb. The stars grow brighter. Somewhere below, the explanation machine is already churning, preparing cover stories and deflections and half-truths. And somewhere in the American imagination, a mythology is taking shape that will outlast the aircraft, the pilot, the base itself, and possibly even the nation that created them. Such is the strange legacy of Paradise Ranch. Now, dear friends, let these thoughts settle like the desert evening as sleep approaches. The stories of Area 51, like all good stories, contain more questions than answers. But perhaps that's fitting. The universe is full of mysteries, and some of them may never be solved. Our task is not to resolve every question, but to wonder well, to approach the unknown with curiosity rather than fear, and to remember that the most extraordinary truths are often hiding in plain sight, concealed not by conspiracies, but by our own assumptions about what is possible. Dream of vast desert skies and aircraft reaching for the stars. Dream of engineers hunched over blueprints and pilots ascending into darkness, and ordinary people doing extraordinary things in places that don't appear on any map. And know that somewhere tonight the work continues. The secrets accumulate. The questions multiply. And the dance between what we know and what we merely suspect goes on, as it has since the first human looked up at the night sky and wondered what else might be out there. Good night, friends. The morning will bring its own mysteries. For now, let the desert silence settle over you and sleep.